It was a regular Thursday afternoon. The weather was nice, so I decided to go for a walk. I had been feeling stressed lately, and the woods always seemed to help. I walked the usual path, the one that loops back to the edge of town. But as I was walking, I noticed a narrow path I hadn't seen before. It looked like it had been recently cleared. Curious, I decided to follow it. It was probably just an old trail someone had rediscovered. The path was narrow and overgrown in some places. It twisted and turned, making it hard to see very far ahead. I was about to turn back when I saw him, a man in a dark hoodie standing in the middle of the path facing away from me. He was completely still. For a moment I thought he might be lost or hurt. I turned around and started walking back the way I came, trying to act casual. But after a few steps I glanced over my shoulder. He was following me. Not running, just walking slowly, but definitely following me. My heart started pounding. I picked up my pace, hoping to put some distance between us, but every time I looked back he was still there, matching my speed. The path seemed to stretch on forever. I couldn't see the main trail anymore. I had no idea how far I'd wandered. I started to panic. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was just taking the same path. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I broke into a jog. The branches and leaves scratched at my arms and face, but I didn't care. I needed to get away. I glanced back again. He was still there, closer now. I could see his face under the hood, but his expression was blank, almost like he wasn't really seeing me. My jog turned into a full sprint. I crashed through the underbrush, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from him. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I didn't stop. Finally, I burst out of the woods onto the main trail. I stopped to catch my breath, looking around frantically. There was no sign of the man. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm down. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing, but then I heard it. Footsteps coming from the path behind me. I didn't wait to see who it was. I took off running again, following the main trail back to town. I didn't stop until I was back at my house, locking the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his blank face staring at me. I kept thinking I heard footsteps outside my window, but when I looked, there was no one there. The next day I told a few friends about it. They tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just someone messing around, but I could tell they didn't believe me. I started avoiding the woods. I took different routes to work, avoiding any paths that went near them. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. One night, about a week later, I was walking home from a friend's house. It was late, and the streets were empty. I was about halfway home when I heard footsteps behind me. I froze, my heart pounding. I turned around slowly. There he was, standing under a streetlight, the same blank expression on his face. He didn't move, just stared at me. I took a step back, then another, before turning and running as fast as I could. I didn't look back until I reached my house. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking, and finally got the door open. I locked the door behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I checked all the windows and doors, making sure they were locked. I felt like I was losing my mind. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept my phone in my hand, ready to call the police. But I knew they wouldn't believe me. I didn't even believe myself. The next few days were a blur. I went to work, tried to act normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I saw someone in a hoodie, my heart would race and I'd have to fight the urge to run. My friends noticed something was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them the whole story. Then one evening I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know who this guy was and why he was following me. I went back to the woods, this time during the day. I walked the same path, feeling a mix of fear and determination. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet. I walked for what felt like hours, retracing my steps. But there was no sign of him, no footsteps, no dark figure lurking in the shadows. Just the rustle of leaves and the distant sound of birds. I started to think maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. I was about to turn back when I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat. There he was, standing just a few feet away. His face was still blank, but his eyes seemed to bore into me. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. He didn't answer, just stood there staring. I felt a surge of anger and fear. I wasn't going to run this time. Over the next few days I tried to go about my life as usual, but it was impossible. Everywhere I went I felt his presence. I started to see him everywhere, standing across the street, lurking in alleyways, even in my own backyard. But every time I tried to confront him, he would disappear. I was exhausted, mentally and physically. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I felt like I was going insane. My friends noticed the change in me, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them the whole story. And that's when I saw it. A note slipped under my door. I picked it up with trembling hands. It was a single sheet of paper with one word scrawled across it: run. I dropped the note and backed away, my mind racing. What did it mean? Was it a threat? A warning? I didn't know, but I knew I couldn't stay in my house. I grabbed my keys and ran out the door, not caring where I was going. I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to clear my head. Eventually, I found myself at a motel on the edge of town. I checked in, paid in cash, and locked the door behind me. I didn't sleep at all that night, jumping at every sound, every creak of the floorboards. The next morning, I checked out and drove back to my house. It was quiet, almost too quiet. I checked every room, every closet, but there was no sign of him. For the first time in days, I started to relax. I grabbed a flashlight and headed back to the woods, my mind made up. I walked the same path, my heart pounding in my chest. The woods were silent, almost eerily so. I walked for what felt like hours, but I saw no sign of him. Just as I was about to give up, I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around and there he was, standing just a few feet away, his blank face emotionless. I felt a surge of anger and fear. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted. He said nothing, just stepped closer. I raised my flashlight, ready to defend myself. But then, he vanished. One moment he was there, the next he was gone. I stood there, alone in the woods, realizing that my nightmare was far from over. I was 14 and my parents had gone out to a dinner party, leaving me to fend for myself. It wasn't the first time, and I wasn't scared. I'd gotten used to the creaks and groans of the house settling. I like to think of it as an old friend, creaky, but comforting. That night though, something was different. I was in the living room watching TV with the volume low so I could hear if the phone rang or if my parents came home early. Around 10 p.m. I heard a strange scraping sound coming from the kitchen. At first I thought it was just the house. But then, I heard it again, louder this time. It sounded like metal on wood, like someone dragging a chair across the floor. My heart skipped a beat. I paused the TV and strained my ears, trying to figure out what the sound was. The scraping noise continued, and now it was mixed with a faint rustling. I told myself it was probably nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the noises were too real, too distinct. I decided to investigate. Grabbing the closest thing I could find, a heavy flashlight, I crept towards the kitchen. The scraping sound grew louder with each step, echoing through the dark, empty house. There, sitting at our dining table, was a man. He was hunched over, his back to me, his hands resting on the table. I couldn't see his face, but I could tell he was older, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s. His clothes were wrinkled and his hair was a mess. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were glued to the floor. I just stood there, staring at the stranger in my house. Finally he spoke, his voice low and raspy. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, still not turning around. "I just need to see her one last time." I didn't know what to say. My mouth was dry and my mind was racing. Who was this man? How did he get into my house? And who was he talking about? Who are you? I managed to stammer. The man sighed and leaned back in his chair, finally turning to face me. His eyes were tired and sad, like he hadn't slept in days. He looked at me with a kind of desperate hope. "My name is David," he said. "I lost my wife a few months ago. She died in a car accident. I haven't been able to move on. I've been searching for some kind of closure, something to help me say goodbye." I didn't know what to say. I felt a mix of fear and pity for this man. He looked so broken, so lost. "But why are you here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is my house." David nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know. I'm sorry for intruding. I don't know where else to go. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I came here I could find some peace." His words didn't make any sense. Why would he come to my house for closure? I didn't know him, and I certainly didn't know his wife. "You should go," I said, my voice trembling. But could you do me one favor before I go?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to tell him to get out, to call the police, but another part of me, the part that saw the pain in his eyes, couldn't turn him away. "What is it?" I asked. David took a deep breath and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small worn photo. He handed it to me and I saw a picture of a woman, smiling and happy. She looked about his age with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Her name was Emily," he said. "She was my world. I just want to hear her voice one last time." I looked at the photo, then back at David. His request seemed impossible. How could I help him hear his wife's voice again? "I don't understand," I said. "What do you want me to do?" David's eyes filled with tears. Just talk to me, tell me something she might have said, something comforting. I felt a lump in my throat. I didn't know Emily, and I didn't know what she might have said, but I could see how much this meant to David. Okay, I said softly. I'll try. I took a deep breath and looked at the photo again, imagining what kind of person Emily might have been. David, I said, my voice shaking, she wouldn't want you to be sad. She'd want you to remember the good times you had together. She'd want you to find happiness again. David closed his eyes, tears streaming down his cheeks. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you. He stood up slowly, his movements heavy and tired. I'll go now, he said. Thank you for listening. I watched as he walked towards the door, his shoulders slumped. Just before he left, he turned back to me. You're a good person, he said. Don't ever lose that. And then he was gone, disappearing into the night. When my parents came home later that night, I didn't tell them about David. I didn't know how to explain it, and I wasn't sure they would believe me anyway. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he might still be out there, searching for his wife, trying to find closure. The next few days were a blur. I went to school, did my homework, and tried to forget about the man in my kitchen. But every time I walked past the dining table, I couldn't help but think of him sitting there, waiting for something he would never find. One evening about a week later, I heard that scraping sound again. My heart skipped a beat and I felt a chill run down my spine. I was in my room doing homework, but the noise was unmistakable. It was coming from the kitchen. I grabbed my flashlight and crept downstairs, my mind racing with fear and curiosity. When I reached the kitchen, I saw him again. David sitting at the table, staring at the photo of his wife. David, I whispered, my voice trembling. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with the same sadness as before. I'm sorry, he said. I can't move on. I thought I could, but I can't. I didn't know what to say. Part of me was scared, but another part of me felt a strange kind of sympathy for him. It's okay, I said softly. You can stay for a little while. David nodded, his eyes grateful. Thank you, he said. You're very kind. We sat there in silence for a while, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, David spoke again. Do you believe in fate? He asked. I shrugged. I don't know, I said. I guess I've never really thought about it. David nodded, his eyes distant. I used to believe that everything happened for a reason, but now, I don't know what to believe. He looked at the photo again, his expression filled with longing. Emily used to say that we were meant to be together, that we were soulmates, but now she's gone, and I don't know what to do. I felt a lump in my throat. I didn't know how to comfort him, but I wanted to try. Maybe you're meant to find a new purpose, I said. Maybe Emily would want you to keep living, to find happiness again. David looked at me, his eyes filled with a glimmer of hope. Do you really think so? He asked. I nodded, trying to sound confident. Yes, I do. I think she'd want you to be happy. David smiled, a small, sad smile. Thank you, he said. You've given me a lot to think about. He stood up, his movement slow and deliberate. I should go, he said. I've taken up enough of your time. I watched as he walked towards the door, his shoulders still slumped. Just before he left, he turned back to me. Thank you, he said again. You're a good person. And then he was gone, disappearing into the night once more. I stood there for a long time, my heart heavy. I didn't know if I had helped him, but I hoped I had. As I walked back to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a difference, even if it was just a small one. The next few days passed uneventfully. I went to school, did my homework, and tried to focus on other things. But I couldn't stop thinking about David and his wife. I wondered if he had found the closure he was looking for, or if he was still wandering, lost and alone. It all started when my buddy Steve and I decided to take a late-night drive. Steve's always been a night owl, and I've got a habit of going along with his crazy ideas. This time, it was a drive through some old back roads just outside our town. Steve had this old map he'd found in his grandpa's attic, and he thought it would be cool to follow it. The map was super detailed, showing all these little roads and paths that weren't on any modern maps. He was convinced there was something interesting out there, and I didn't have anything better to do, so I agreed to go with him. We started off around 10 p.m. The roads were dark and winding, just what you'd expect from old country lanes. The air was cool, and the sky was clear, so we had a pretty good view of the stars. Steve was driving, and I was navigating with the map. At first, everything was fine. We were laughing and joking, talking about everything and nothing. About an hour in, we reached a fork in the road that wasn't on the map. One way led to a newer paved road, but the other was a dirt path that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Steve, being Steve, decided to take the dirt path. He said it would be more fun, and maybe we'd find something cool. As soon as we turned onto the dirt road, things started to get weird. The air seemed to get colder, and a thick fog began to roll in from nowhere. It was odd because it had been so clear just moments before. Steve joked about it being like a horror movie, but there was a nervous edge to his voice. I was starting to feel uneasy too, but I didn't say anything. We kept driving, but the fog was getting thicker, and it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The trees on either side of the road seemed to close in on us, their branches almost touching the car. The road itself was rough and bumpy, making it hard to keep a steady pace. Steve had to slow down to avoid hitting any hidden potholes or rocks. After what felt like forever, we saw a light up ahead. It was faint, but it stood out against the darkness and fog. As we got closer, we realized it was coming from an old gas station. The place looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The paint was peeling, the windows were boarded up, and the gas pumps were rusted and broken. But the light was on, coming from a single bulb, hanging above the entrance. We pulled up to the gas station and got out of the car. The air was freezing now, and the fog was so thick it was like walking through soup. Steve and I exchanged uneasy glances, but neither of us wanted to be the first to suggest turning back. We walked up to the door, which creaked open as soon as Steve touched it. Inside, the gas station was just as rundown as the outside. Dust covered everything, and the shelves were empty. There was an old cash register on the counter, and behind it, a door that probably led to a back room. The light was coming from a flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. Steve walked over to the counter and called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" His voice echoed in the empty room. No answer. He called out again, but there was still no response. We were about to leave when we heard a noise coming from the back room. It sounded like someone shuffling around. Steve looked at me, and I could see the fear in his eyes. But he squared his shoulders and headed for the door. I followed, my heart pounding in my chest. Steve pushed open the door to the back room, and we were hit with a blast of cold air. The room was dark, except for a small window in the back that let in a bit of moonlight. There was a figure standing in the shadows, but we couldn't make out any details. "Hello?" Steve said again, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move. We took a few steps closer and the floorboards creaked under our feet. The figure still didn't move. We were only a few feet away when the figure finally stepped into the light. It was an old man, his face lined with wrinkles and his hair white as snow. He was wearing old, tattered clothes and had a vacant look in his eyes. "You boys lost?" he asked, his voice raspy. Yeah," Steve said. "We were just driving around and saw the light. Thought we'd check it out." The old man nodded slowly. "Not many people come down this way anymore. The road's not on any maps." Steve showed him the map he'd found in his grandpa's attic. The old man took it and studied it for a moment before handing it back. "This map is old," he said. "Real old. The road you're on doesn't lead anywhere anymore. Best turn back the way you came." We thanked the old man and left the gas station, our nerves on edge. As soon as we got back to the car, Steve floored it, and we sped back down the dirt road. The fog was still thick, but we didn't care. We just wanted to get out of there. After what felt like an eternity, we finally made it back to the main road. The fog cleared up almost instantly, and the air warmed up. It was like we'd driven out of another world. Steve and I didn't talk much on the way back home. We were both too shaken by what had happened. When we finally pulled into my driveway, Steve turned to me and said, "Let's not do that again." I nodded in agreement. We never spoke about that night again, but it's always stayed with me. I don't know what we saw out there or who that old man was, but I do know one thing: there are some places you just shouldn't go, no matter how curious you are. The next day I tried to find the dirt road again. I thought maybe if I saw it in the daylight it wouldn't seem so creepy. But no matter how many times I drove up and down that stretch of road, I couldn't find it. It was like it had vanished. Steve said he couldn't find it either. We asked around town if anyone knew about an old gas station out there, but no one did. It was like the whole experience had been a dream, but I knew it hadn't been. The fear I felt was too real to be just a figment of my imagination. Every time I drive by that area though, I get a chill down my spine, and I can't help but glance over, half expecting to see the fog rolling in and the faint glow of that old gas station.